Welcome back to Dana's Wanderlust Crochet with Dana and Dooley. Please don't run away screaming because you see a granny square here. This tutorial is not for the absolute beginner, and it's not necessarily for somebody who has already mastered the granny square. This is for those of you right in between. This is for those of you who have crocheted enough that you're pretty much getting to know your tension, your stitches are becoming even, but you still haven't figured out exactly the placement of everything and what the granny square is all about. The granny square is a very historical pattern. In some parts of Europe, they call it the American square because it looks as if this was invented in maybe in the 1800s. It was done by taking old garments and unraveling them and using those scrap pieces to put together these squares. And then when there were enough squares, they put them together into blankets. And what they would do was hand those old garments to the senior members of the household. And it would be, part of what they did in, their downtime to sit and unravel those pieces of yarn and use the scraps to make these squares. And that's where the name granny square came from. Traditionally, the granny square is done in a two-sided manner. I know that you cannot tell which side I began with. And I like two-sided blankets. I don't like one-sided blankets. This is how they were originally done. And honestly, I think it gives more depth to the stitches. I really pay attention to not only are stitches clean and even, but what kind of depth and texture do they have. And I believe the two-sided granny square gives us more dimension. So you're going to need, at least what I have used for this video is a 4-weight 100% acrylic. This is Paint Box Simply Aran 4-weight yarn. And here's my needle, my H-hook, and my scissors. So please join along with me to do this American classic. Okay, so I have my rat's nest of pink here that I'm going to start with, and I'm going to do a magic circle. If you don't know how to do a magic circle, just look it up on YouTube. The way I learned to do it, I just Googled crochet magic circle, and the first video that came up has been the one that I use. Chain 3 counts as your first double crochet. 2 more double crochet into the corner. Most of us know how to do a granny square. Okay, and I'm keeping the tail and everything. Remember, this is not a beginner's tutorial, an absolute beginner's, but, less experienced crocheters can do this. Okay, since this is a corner, I'm going to chain 2 and then do 3 double crochets. I got to look around the side of the phone here. And of course, I'm in my truck, so it is pretty awkward. Well, it's awkward anyway, looking through the phone, because I don't have, video equipment. But being in the truck, it's even more awkward. Okay, so I've got 3 double crochet. Well, the chain 1 counts as the first one. 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet, chain 2. And what I'm going to end up with is these chain 2 spaces are my corners, of course, and my 3 double crochet, what I'm going to call granny clusters, are the sides. And I'm going to have 4 of each. 4 chain 2 spaces and 4 granny clusters. I'm just going to keep pulling on that. Here we go. And my rat's nest of pink yarn over there. Whoa, what do we got going on here, Dana? Okay, there we go. And I really like the classic way of doing a granny square. Done a little bit of study on it. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. I've got 4 of those. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 chain 2. So when I slip stitch over, I don't go into the chain, the third one, you know, the third one up of the chain. I go into that middle double crochet. And then I'm going to pull down my center, and I get a pretty, I can still leave a little gap there, but I like it a little closer than if you did the chain 4. Okay. This is where newer granny squares differ from the classic. I'm going to turn my work. I'm going to chain 3. And that counts as my first double crochet in this corner. Now, because I'm crocheting into the chain space of the corner, that means I'm going to do the granny cluster, chain 2, and another granny cluster into that chain 2 space from round 1. One more. Now, again, this is not how I teach beginners to do a granny square. This is for someone who's got a little bit more experience. Not a whole lot. But when your tension starts getting, you know, more consistent, then I recommend, you know, moving on to this version of granny square. Now, I'm only going to chain 1. I chain 1 to go over, to skip over the top of a granny cluster. Now I'm back in another corner, and we know from the last corner that a corner consists of a granny cluster, which is 3 double crochet, a chain 2, slide that over, and another granny cluster. Every time you go into a chain 2 space, it's granny cluster, chain 2, granny cluster. See if I can get this straightened out. Hang on. Okay, back to work here. Now ooh, dog hair. Oh, that's fun. Okay, so since I'm going to skip over the top of a granny cluster, then it's just chain 1. Then I'm back into a 2 chain space, so it's a granny cluster, chain 2, and a granny cluster, which is 3 double crochet. And again, now I'm going to skip over the top of this, sorry about my thumbnails, okay, the top of this granny cluster, so I'm going to chain 1, and then a granny cluster in the corner, chain 2, and a granny cluster. Then I'm going to chain 2 because I'm skipping over the top of this granny cluster. And again, I'm going to slip stitch not into the top of the chain 3, but into the top of the middle double crochet of that first granny cluster. And I leave this tail out. I like to weave in my ends as I finish off a color, but I'm going to leave the center one out because, yes, many of us know that the top of these stitches tilt towards you when you're on, you know, the side that you just completed. But I leave that in the back of round 1, just for reference. And I will finish this off and we'll start with the next color. Okay, so round 1 and round 2 done in the pink. I flip it back over because this is a 2-sided granny square. And we're just going to join in any chain 2 corner. Remember, chain 2s are in the corners. Chain 1s are the ones that skip over a granny cluster. So I'm going to do 2 rounds in the purple. Slip stitch. I'm going to kind of slide it over. Chain 3. And 2 more. Double crochet. And because we are in a chain 2 corner space, we're adding another corner. So, chain 2 and another granny cluster right here in that chain 2 space. Here's where we start to change a little bit on round 3. Now remember, like I said, when skipping over a granny cluster to crochet past it, we only chain 1. Now I'm going to put a granny cluster into this chain space, which is 3 double crochet. Now, yes, I'm coming to a corner, but I have to skip over this granny cluster in order to get to that corner chain space. So what do we do when we skip over a granny cluster? We chain 1. Now, going into a corner space, we do another corner, which is a granny cluster. Oops, that ain't no double crochet. Here we go. Slide them over, a granny cluster, chain 2, and then a granny cluster. We do that in every corner, which is 3 double crochet, chain 2, 3 double crochet. Now where are we? We are at a granny cluster and we have a chain space here that is not a corner that we're going to crochet into. What do we do when we skip over a granny cluster? We chain 1. Then we do a granny cluster in the chain space. Okay, take a look now. I've had experienced crocheters tell me that this is their problem. They forget where their sides are and where their corners are. Now I am skipping over a granny cluster. What do I do when I skip over a granny cluster? I chain 1. Which chain space am I going to be crocheting into? A corner. So what do? We do a corner. Granny cluster, chain 2, and a granny cluster for every corner. Chain 2, granny cluster, now what do? We're skipping over a cluster on the side there and going into this chain space. So we're going to chain 1. Every time we skip over a cluster, we chain 1. Go into the next chain space and do a cluster. It's not technically a granny cluster, but you know, that's what we like to call it. Okay, I'm going to skip over a cluster to go into the corner chain 2. What do we do when we skip over a cluster? We chain 1, yes. Okay. And because I'm in a corner, what do we do in corners? We do a cluster, we chain 2, and we do another cluster. That's how corners are made in a granny square. What's next? I have to skip over this cluster. So I chain 1 and I put a cluster in this chain space. And even though I'm coming to the end of this round, what have I got in front of me? I've got a cluster to skip over, so I'm going to chain 1. That's what we do when we skip over a cluster. And like I've told you before, I go into this second, instead of going into the chain, I let my slip stitch into that double crochet of the cluster. That slip stitch kind of replaces the top of that chain for me, and I like the way that looks. Okay, now that's round 3. Turn your work. This is a 2-sided granny square. I'm going to chain 3. 1, 2, 3. That counts as the first double crochet of this cluster. So that's 3 right there. I've got a cluster to skip over, so I'm going to chain 1 and put a cluster in this chain space. I have to skip over a cluster, so I'm going to chain 1. And the chain space I'm going into is a corner, so we'll do a granny cluster, a chain 2, and a granny cluster in the corner. Chain 2. Now I look where I'm at. Look, I've got to skip over a cluster. That means chain 1 and put a cluster into that chain space. I have to skip over another cluster, so I'm going to chain 1, put a cluster into that chain space. I have to skip over a cluster, so I'm going to chain 1, and look, it's a corner. So we do a granny cluster, a chain 2, and a granny cluster, into the chain 2 space in the corner. Oh, I've got to skip over another cluster, so I'm going to chain 1 and 3 double crochet into this chain space. Chain 1, three double crochet into this chain space. Chain 1. Oh, I'm at another corner. How exciting. Now, what do our corners consist of? A granny cluster, a chain 2, and a granny cluster, which is 3 double crochet, chain 2, and 3 double crochet. Skipping over a cluster, chain 1. We're almost there. We are almost there. Skipping over a cluster, so I'm going to chain 1. Skipping over a cluster, so I chained 1 and I'm going into this corner. And because it's a corner space, I'm going to do a cluster, a chain 2, and a cluster in that same corner chain space. Now it's time to, connect to my first cluster here, but look, I have to skip over a cluster, which is where we do a chain 1. Now, for my version, I slip stitch into that middle double crochet of the cluster. So let's recap. We have a 3 double crochet granny cluster in these chain spaces. Then I chain 1 whenever I skip a cluster, skip over a cluster to do another granny cluster into a chain space. Chain 1s along the sides. Chain 2 in the corner where you're putting 2 clusters in the previous chain space. So chain 1 on the sides, chain 2 in the corners. I will finish off this round and come back. Okay. I am joining in any corner. Oh, sure I am. Let's see. That was a nice split. Okay. I am joining in any corner, chain 3, which counts as my first double crochet. I'm going to do 2 more to complete the granny cluster. Now I am in a corner. So what does that mean? That means chain 2. And then another granny cluster, which is 3 double crochet. I have to skip over a cluster, so I'm going to chain 1 and put 3 double crochet in there. Hands are a little bit clammy, so nothing's gliding really nice. That's okay. Now, skipping over a cluster, so I'll chain 1 and put 3 double crochet in here. Chain 1, 3 double crochet. Try to rest my elbow. Chain 1. Now I'm going into a corner. What do we do in the corner? 3 double crochet. Chain 2. And 3 double crochet. Now, every time I go over a granny cluster, you'll notice, okay, so I'm on round 5. In round 4, there are 4 clusters per side. And every time I go over one, I'm going to chain 1, stitch down. Then I'm going to, okay, getting excited. It's hard to do in the truck with the phone. Okay, chain 1 and put a cluster in each one of the spaces between the other clusters. Chain 1. Chain 1. I'm going to show you one more corner, then I'm going to pause. I'm going to show you because the next round is not what you think it's going to be. Okay, chain 1 to skip over a cluster. And now that we're working into a corner, we're making another corner, which is a granny cluster, chain 2, and another granny cluster. You can meet me back around. Okay, so I just completed this last granny cluster, and even though I'm going to connect to the beginning of my round, I still have to skip over a granny cluster, so I'm going to chain 1, and I'm going into the middle one. I slip stitch in there rather than the top of the chain 3, because I think it makes a cleaner look. And I'm not going to finish off because, as you know, we turn. But I want to point out a few things. If you're getting confused as to how many clusters, you know, per side and how many in the corners, think about this. I'm on round 5, and if I just look at one side of round 5, never mind, you know, these second ones in the corners, how many do I have on the side? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And in round 4, on each side, I have 1, 2, 3, 4. See how that works? Round 3, I have 3 per side. Round 2, I have 2 per side. Just one way for those that get a little confused about, you know, where each cluster goes. I mean, I have seen experienced crocheters. Oh, I'm not finishing off, duh. Okay, I am going to turn like normal. But this is just going to be this is what you're going to call a 5-round granny square. But what I'm going to do on this 6th round is do a single crochet all the way around. If you know me, I like a good clean edge. And if I'm going to, I like to make this last round and the single crochet round to be the same color I'm going to use to join all the squares when I make a granny square project. And this is how I make sure it lays nice and flat and all my stitches look even. This is just, I just like a nice join. So I'm going to chain 1, and I'm right here in a chain space. What do we have in a chain space along the side? It's just one chain. So I'm going to put 1 single crochet into a chain 1 space. Now this is the only time I'm working into the tops of stitches except when I'm joining. So I have 3 double crochets here. I'm going to put 3 single crochets. I'm basically on this finishing round. I don't want to call it a round 6. I want to call it a finishing round. Each stitch gets 1 single crochet. Now this is a chain 1 space, 1 single crochet, and then 1 in the top of each of those 3 double crochets, a single crochet in the chain 1 space, and then 1 in the top of these 3 double crochet, I have another chain 1 space here, so it gets 1 single crochet. Here we go into the corner. Each of these 3 in this first cluster gets a single crochet in it. there. Now, what do I have? I have a chain 2 space, 2 single crochet in the chain 2 space. This is nothing but a finishing round. Now I have 3 double crochet, and they each get 1 single crochet in the tops of those stitches. This is making a nice edge that will be easy to connect to when I join my squares. This gets 1 single crochet, and I put 1 single crochet in the tops of each of these double crochets. I want you to do that all the way around, remembering to put 2 in the corner, 1 in each of these, and 1 on top of each of the doubles. I'll meet you at the end. Okay, coming around the last corner, I'm going to put 2 in the corner chain space, 1 in each of the next 3 double crochets. Sure you are. Okay, it's right there. And I'm going to slip stitch to the top of the first 1, 2, the first one here. Okay. Now, something I want to point out about weaving in the end of this last tail. In the previous rounds, it made no difference. But in this round, it's going to make a difference where you weave this in. I am not going to weave it in the tops of these stitches. Why? Because I want those stitches clear and even and nice for when I go to join this square to another square. I'm going to take it down the stitch, and then I'm going to weave it back and forth through here, just like I do with this one down here. That way these stitches are clear for whatever join you're going to use to join your blanket squares together. Now, here it is. Typically, I think granny squares done with, scrap pieces of yarn were done usually in 4 rounds instead of 5. Today, yarn is more abundant. I like a 5 round. I like the size of them. So, I hope you like the original version of the 2-sided granny square that I'm showing you. That is a tribute to how granny squares were originally done. I hope this helps those of you who have had trouble with granny squares in the past. Thanks for joining me. Love you guys. Bye.